I'd like to welcome you all. Chag Sameach, regards from Jerusalem. And I'm really excited to be sharing this virtual Pesach tour with you. Just so you know, I'm going to be I have the participants and the chat and all of you on screen. So I'm not going to be able to see you anyway as I speak, only at the end. So if you want to save bandwidth so you can see better, you can turn off your video. It's completely up to you. I'm going to get started right away. So first of all, welcome. My name is Nachliel Sullivan. Some of you know me. Some of you saw this online advertisement. I appreciate that you took the time and 90 minutes out of your day. I hope this is going to be helpful and informative. I generally guide tours at the Metropolitan Museum and in museums in North America and Europe and in Israel. And this is a challenging time for the tourism industry and the educators as well, but it's also a very interesting opportunity to explore these things. So instead of me, for example, talking about what's in Egypt, I can actually take you to Egypt, so to speak, in virtual form and really enrich the experience of going through the museum. And so I would like to combine the Metropolitan Museum of Art with Google Earth and Google Street View on ancient Egypt, really as the best way to sort of talk about ancient Egypt, Mitzrayim, Pesach, and to be able to think about these things in a contemporary fashion, to take ancient Egypt and to think about it in terms of our lives. So let's get started. I'm going to be sharing with you a screenshot, a screen share with two different things. One of them is going to be my slideshow, which is this. The other one's going to be my browser where I'm going into Google Earth. So I'm going to be bouncing between. I hope that you don't get vertigo. This is virtual. This is just how it is. So we're going to get started. So in order to understand ancient Egypt and the Exodus, the most important thing we need to talk about, of course, is Egypt. And we need to talk about Egypt from the point of view of the Egyptians. And so for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you into Google Earth. This is Google Earth, and I'm going to show you some cool things that you can also do from your desktop so you get a little bit more familiar. This is all basically Google Maps, but you can use Google Earth. It's the same thing. Now we're going to go straight down into Egypt. Just going to turn off that guy right now. Okay, so we're going now into Egypt. Now, when we want to talk about the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus and freedom, we really need to appreciate what it means to leave a country, a land, a kingdom, which was called Bet Avadim, the house of slavery. What does that even mean? Like, yes, we were slaves there, but what does it mean, a place which is par excellence? It is the house of slavery, right? So in order to understand that, we need to see the land itself, and that's really going to help us. So let's just orient ourselves a little bit. This is the earth. Of course, I'm sure you've heard of it. Down below here is Sudan. In ancient times, it was called Nubia. And what's most important for us is this line, which is the Nile River, which flows from the Blue and the White Nile tributaries here in Central Africa. And it goes all the way it pours into the Mediterranean Sea, running through Egypt. Now, Egypt is called the land of the Nile. And that's for the important reason that the entire land is only the Nile. Now, before modern technology, which allowed us to make installations and infrastructure and to bring water into the desert, Egypt was completely and totally dependent on the natural flow of the Nile, which dictated where people can live and where they can't. And so everything to the east and to the west of the Nile was desert and was death. So Egypt's natural borders was the Mediterranean from the north, and from the east and from the west, they had desert. So nobody could invade them. They were impenetrable. And this gave Egypt the ability both to be somewhat isolated and not influenced by other cultures. They sort of had their very unique and own culture. But also, it gave them protection and made them feel basically they are the best and the most powerful. Nobody invades Egypt until, of course, the time of the Assyrian Empire, and then finally the Babylonians and the Persians and so on. And then Egypt, as we see in the Nevi'im and the prophets, is also told, you're not such hot stuff anymore, right? Prepare to be invaded. So, you know, the big crocodile, the Tanina Gadol, who sits there inside your Nile thinking, this is the world, this is it. Well, not anymore. So that's going to come to an end. So let's take a look at a few different things. First of all, the land of Egypt is all the Nile. All of this green area is fertile Nile ground, and everything to the east and to the west, on the right and the left, is desert. And so in ancient Egypt, you basically lived on the Nile, which is why it's also called the land of the Nile, the narrowest country in the world. And the Hebrew for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which means Metzarim, which means constraints, because the country is actually constrained on all sides by desert and is completely dependent on the Nile. Now, there's a lot to talk about, but I want to first of all just point out that Egypt's land was divided into two different countries, two lands, and that's why Egypt is called the two lands. And those lands were united by the first pharaoh of the dynasty, of the first dynasty, called Pharaoh Narmer. Or actually, he wasn't called Pharaoh at the time, but we'll get to that later. He was the one who united Upper and Lower Egypt. So we're going to go a little more into depth onto that. Just to show you a few important things, in just a moment, we're going to talk about Upper and Lower Egypt. First of all, notice, I'm going to do this, but we're going to look at it later. Let's see if I can twist this. Okay, you see what I did there? Now, this is the way Egyptians looked at the world. Look at that. The Nile comes from up there. It comes from, who knows where it comes from? It comes from the gods. You think that they would have traveled all the way to southern Sudan? They didn't travel that far. For the Egyptians, the Nile was just a given, and it flowed up from the heavens. It just flowed. It came. I don't mean really the heavens. I just mean like it's a blessing, right? It just flowed and just came, and it was a constant. And yes, they had nilometers, which told you how high it was going to be, which is very important, because when you want to collect taxes from production, well, how much did you produce? Well, we know how high the Nile was, so we can know how to set the taxes for this year, because if you had this much water, right, this altitude, then that's how much you can produce. And so this is kind of cool, but that's going more into Egyptian, Egyptian taxes. That's a separate subject, but that's going to be important for us later when we talk about Egypt's production. Okay, so the Nile flows from Sudan, and this is really, you're looking up. For Egyptians, and this is even true in the Tanakh, in the biblical orientation of directions in Egypt. I'll give you an example. Biblical directions, as in antiquity, oriented themselves based on the rise of the sun, which you can say is sort of like an agreeable, objective direction, right? So ancient maps are looking up, are looking towards the east, towards the sun, which is why it's also called kedem, kadima, which means in Hebrew, forward. It says you're looking forward. And so your right-hand side is the south, your left-hand side is the north. And that's indeed how Tanakh, how the Bible looks at the land of Israel. If you want to understand directions in the Bible and Tanakh, you really need to assume that Kedem is east and Achor is west. And so Hayam HaAcharon, the western sea is the Mediterranean Sea because it's behind you, and et cetera, et cetera. Now in Egypt, for example, in the plague of locusts, it says Ruach Kadim, a Kadima, apparently an eastern wind brought all of the locusts. But we know that locusts actually came from the south, from Nubia, from Sudan. But if you're in Egypt, that is Kadima, that is forward. So there's implications to this. It's kind of cool. Now this entire area is called, this entire Nile area from where it begins in Egypt is called the Nile Valley, all of this. And they also called it Upper Egypt. Why upper? Because it's up, right? South is, north is down. And so down, you know, Ender's Game, the enemy's gate is always down. It's all about how you look at the world. That's what makes the difference. And so this green shape, the Greek shape, the Greek letter delta, like the letter D, this was called the Nile Delta because of that shape, nothing to do with the airline. And this was called Lower Egypt because it was lower down. Now, Egypt was divided into these two lands, and the first pharaoh was able to rule both of them. And this is going to be very, very important for us, and we're going to see how. And so in order to continue this, I want to take you back into our presentation. And now let's orient ourselves. So the Mishnah in Pesachim says, in every generation, a person must see themselves as if they left Egypt. So what does it mean as if we left Egypt? You could say on the one hand, let's imagine ourselves as ancient Hebrews in ancient Egypt, you know, Prince of Egypt, and there's many fascinating customs. There's actually Maimonides reads this as leharot et atzma. A person must show themselves as if. So you dress up, and the Syrian custom is to say nisharotam, like to dress up and to say, where are you coming from? I came from Egypt. Where are you going? To the land of Israel. What are you carrying? What are your rations? Matzah and maro, matzah and bitter herbs. So like, there's a lot of customs around this. But what I'd like to say is that, and to try to achieve in this presentation, in this tour, is that we need to sort of understand what it meant as a mentality to live in a country which consists of slave mentality and in which personal freedom was almost impossible to imagine. and what that struggle can be like and how we can experience that today as a personal exodus. And that's what I hope to achieve in this tour. So let's move on. So we're now looking at the land of Egypt. And one more thing I want to say when we're talking about leaving Egypt and going into the land of Israel, which is really, if you look at the Seder night, at the Haggadah, that's where it goes. It goes from we were slaves, and then we talk about the next year in the land of Israel, and here we are, we're in the, like we actually quote the proclamation of the first fruits of the land, of the Bikurim, and we're really talking about freedom in terms of going to Israel. And I would like to show this not in religious terms, but rather in terms of freedom. And that's what I want to show you and hope to achieve. So in Devarim, in Deuteronomy 11, Devarim Yud Aleph, when we're about to come into the land of Israel, Moshe gives us a pep talk and says to us that you need to understand that the land in which you're about to go into to inherit it is not like Egypt. Loch Eretz Mitzrayim, and I sort of highlighted those verses, which you left, in which Tizrat Zaracha Beishkita Peraglecha Kigan He'arak. In other words, in this place, you sort of water with your own labors like a vegetable garden. So you go to the Nile, you sort of draw out canals, drag out the water as much as you can, and the height of that is dictated by the Nilometer, by the inundation of the Nile of that year. And if you put in the work, you've used the given Nile and you've put in the work, and that's it. Like, if you don't succeed, it's because you didn't put in the work. You're still gonna have to pay the taxes if you did, because we know how much you could have achieved this year. So you have this given, the Nile, and it sort of dictates all the life in Egypt and the agriculture and the production and all that stuff. Fine. But the land which, this land which you're about to go into in order to inherit it is completely different than Egypt in the following respect. It is Eretz Harim u'Bikaot. It's a land of hills and valleys. And you will be completely dependent on rain in order to drink water. Now, we're living in Israel now, other than the fact that the Kinneret was almost full, which hasn't happened in years. The only reason it's going down again is because the crazy amount of times people are now washing their hands. But that's the local joke, but there's a lot of them. But people in Israel are conscious of rainwater, and the Israelis here are watching. No, you hear commercials, chayavim lachsoch b'mayim and chaval al kol tipa, and we have this concept called an Israeli shower, which is 5 minutes. And I've been doing this for years living in New York, because in my mind, the Kinnerets, it's not by the red line. You have to preserve water. So living in Eretz Israel, where you're dependent on rainwater, and we read this every day in the Shema, which we repeat the covenant, where the land is going to be blessful and fruitful and functional and give you the rain you need at the right time if you conduct yourself morally and properly. In other words, the land of Israel demands of us a particular moral status in order for the land to give us life. Whereas in Egypt, it's all based on the Pharaoh. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So let's get back to our Pharaoh. Here on the right-hand side, we have our nice little cartoonish Pharaoh. Okay. Sigalit, welcome. So we have our Pharaoh on the right-hand side, who's standing on top of the Nile, which is a painting I made a while ago. I never completed it, but it's this painting of Pharaoh's dream of the wheat sheaves, which he tells Yosef, right? And here he's looking at Egypt. Now, as we saw, Egypt in the eyes of the Egyptians was actually upside down, as we saw. So this is how the Egyptians looked at Egypt. Right, you see Eretz Kush, you see the land of Kush, and I deliberately have the letters upside down because I want you to recognize that it's completely the opposite of the way we look at the world. We look at north these days, which is, the compass is a Chinese invention used for navigation, so obviously the Egyptians didn't use it. So here's what's important. We spoke about the two lands of Egypt. Upper Egypt, which is the southern part of Egypt, it's the Nile Valley. The kings of Egypt wore a distinct crown, which kind of looks like one of those bowling, what do you call them, those bottles? And this is the crown of Upper Egypt. It's kind of conical, it's high up. This is the crown of Lower Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt. Now, the first pharaoh, Narmer, united Upper and Lower Egypt to become one unified kingdom, thus ruling all of the land of the Nile. They unified these crowns into what's called the double crown, as you see. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is going to be very important, both in terms of mythology and in terms of the propaganda of the structures, the buildings, the temples, and the monuments of the pharaohs, which we're hopefully going to see in Egypt. So Pharaoh now is wearing the crown of the double crown of Egypt. And this is really how the Egyptians saw the Pharaoh. He was the uniter of Upper and Lower Egypt, the ruler of the entire land of the Nile. He was supreme, and he is like a god. He's born as a human, but when he dies, he becomes a god, and he rules all of Egypt. And everything that you do in Egypt is thanks to his grace, who allows you to work the Nile. And of course, think about it. Who takes the credit, right? the pharaoh takes the credit for all of your success. So you're sort of locked into this mentality for thousands of years, into this pyramid, this control of metaphorical and also real pyramids, right? Which are tombs for the pharaohs built by his own people. Hundreds of years before we ever came to Egypt, by the way. Okay, so let's move further in. Now this is going to be in the museum. I'm going to now take you into the Met. All right. So here we are. For those of you who know, this is the Met. Those who don't, this is Fifth Avenue in the Upper East Side of New York City. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this picture was taken in May 2019. On the bottom of the screen, you can always see it says image capture May 2019. We're going to go inside and take a closer look. So now I'd like us to, I'm just going to show you something. Okay, so this is the Met. I'm switching to the map to make it easier for us. And treasure hunt adventures. Oh, that's kind of cool. All right, now when you press this little character on the bottom right, forgive me, I'm repeating this for people who know it, that's fine. Some people don't know this. You click on him and boom, everything lights up. All of these dots are photos that people stood there with their phone, and you can do it too. And they just turn around 360 and they or up and down, and they sort of upload a visual, or you can just post photos, and you can sort of contribute these through Google Maps, through the app on your phone. It's a lot of cool, a lot of fun. These blue lines are the lines where this little cart with a 360, a special camera, drives through and then records all of it, and you can revisit it. And sometimes it's done at several iterations, and on the older versions of Google Earth, Google Map, you can actually have a timeline of see how things change. So now I'm going to click this guy. Now look on the right, these controls are very important. So you'll forgive me for saying this, but it's worth noting. All of these controls on the bottom right are important. Plus, minus, you can also do with your mouse. You can zoom in and zoom out. But this is important because the Met actually has several floors and a basement. And sometimes when a building has several floors, you need to know how to get from one to the other because you can't use the stairs. So this is it. B1 is basement. This is all the available Google Earth movement in the basement. Floor 1, this is it. On the second floor, this is pretty much all you have. You don't have that much. You only have these floors. Second floor and third floor. So we're going to go to the first floor. We're going to go straight into the main hall. And here we are. Boom. All right. Now, the fun thing is this was captured in June 2010. So this is 10 years ago. Things have changed, right? A lot of things have changed. I'm not going to belabor you with showing you what has changed. It really doesn't matter. But we're going to go straight into ancient Egypt. Where this bench is standing, there actually used to be, there actually is now a statue of the pharaoh. I'm wondering if I, in some way, can show it to you. That would be really, really cool. Let me see. Nope, can't show it to you. Okay, let's go into ancient Egypt. The ancient Egypt is still here. It's a little bit hard to move it. Okay, see Egyptian art right up there? All right, let's go in. So here we are. Welcome to the Metropolitan Museum of Art on 5th Avenue and 85th Street in New York City. And it's all empty. You never get to see it like this unless you're a member and you pay a lot of money and you have the early hours or late hours. It's never empty like this, but this was filmed in a morning where you can see some security guards who you kind of run through. It's kind of like they pop up and vanish when you go through them. This is a mastaba. This is a tomb of a guy named Perineb or Perinebi. And Google Maps can't really go in here, but this is a real tomb. It's one of the only tombs outside of Egypt, and it's in the Met. Everything except this exterior wall is original. It's original Egyptian stone, which was brought into Egypt, and at the bottom of the tomb was a mummy. So we're going to actually talk about pharaohs and mummies and all that cool stuff. Now, I want to focus here for a moment. This dude over here, it's actually a lady, is a Roman mummy. So the mummy here is kind of like typical mummy, but it looks a little bit different than the mummies we're going to see inside. You see that there's a face that was pretty much a character, a caricature, not a caricature, I mean a portrait of the actual person. Egyptians didn't do portraits. Egyptians sort of mass-produced the same thing and gave it different names. And it's important to recognize that. Hold on, I'm just letting someone else in. Okay, Brenda, you're in now. Welcome. So this is a Roman mummy. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the name Cleopatra, Mark Antony, right? The Romans actually controlled Egypt. Before the Romans were the Greeks, and the Greeks were the generals of Alexander the Great. We're talking about Ptolemy, and the Ptolemies became the rulers of Egypt who portrayed themselves as Egyptian pharaohs, as gods, and all that stuff, and they adopted, sort of blended their culture. So this is the Romans doing the same thing. We're going to actually see some Greek mummies as well. This mummy isn't here anymore. It's kind of cool. You're seeing like a blast from the past. Let's look in. Here is another Hellenistic mummy. This one is, I can't do it here, but this area over here has some coins and has a golden coin of Vespasian, Aspasianos. So this is from the time of the end of the Second Temple. So it's kind of like a connection in Jewish history. All right. Now, this is where I can actually do something on Google Earth that I can't do usually. I'm going to actually take you into a temple. Towards the end, we're going to go into it. But these are paintings, which are copies. They're facsimiles. They're copies of original paintings, which are inside tombs until today. And for obvious reasons, you couldn't bring the paintings because they're underground. And so this area, this hallway is called facsimile paintings. And these sort of are circulated or changed every once in a while. And they kind of show you either decorative patterns. I call this staring into the abyss, but that's because it's Egyptian modern art. That's a joke. And this shows you things about daily life, about the people who are buried there, and you can learn a lot about ancient Egyptian life because of their death, their burial. If you actually happen to be a Met in the Met and museums, you go to the Met often. This is PSI. This is a public service announcement. This is the restroom. There's sometimes a very long line, especially for the ladies. You should know that at the very end of the hall right here, there's an entrance to a gift, there's stairs down to a gift shop, and there's a bathroom there, which people usually don't notice. Anyway, so let's take a look at some of the stuff here. All right, shall we? So here's Egyptians working the land with a plow. Here's a cow and other animals. Here's the estate owner sitting here on a throne watching everything being done. There's people picking stuff, wheat and so on, grain. Here there's people, let me see if I can move up closer. Can I? Yes. Here's people dealing with wine, making with a vineyard. And it's important to notice that wine in this time was very, very rare. It was, Egypt doesn't naturally grow wine, only in very rare conditions. So wine was expensive in Egypt. It was something that only royalty had access to. And so drinking wine on the Pesach Seder is sort of like royalty, you know? It's like, I'm a free person. Okay. You see this guy over here? Hard to see him. This is a pharaoh, but we're going to actually see a better one very soon. Okay, here we go. Here we are. All right. This pharaoh. Now, this pharaoh is very important to us for two reasons. Number one, it's when he lived, who he was in his relationship to the Exodus, which I'll talk about in a moment. And there's also what it tells us about how pharaohs were perceived by their people and how they wanted to be perceived, which is what's called basically propaganda. So this pharaoh was sitting in some kind of little balcony, a little like some kind of setting where he's outdoors, and there's hands of servants who are fanning him over here. He's sitting down and there's these tiny people below him. You know what? I'm going to go into this. I'm going to try to zoom into this in a higher quality, in a higher resolution so you can see it. And here we are. This is from the Met's website. They have lots of free resources. A lot of their publications are available for free for download in PDF. Just go to the metmuseum.org. And they also have all these images. So this is the same image, okay? Now, this pharaoh is Amenhotep II. I'm sure you've heard of Amenhotep IV. His name was changed to Akhenaten, and he was called the heretic. He sort of worshipped the sun god Aten and moved the capital. He was kind of very despised by the Egyptians because he sort of tried to change the Egyptian customs. But that doesn't matter right now. What's important to us historically, and this is more of an experiential tour, not a history tour, but I want to just mention historically, the question is, when exactly was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? So, hang on, there's somebody who's trying to join. I'm just going to send him the information. Okay. Okay. So, when was the Exodus? Now, everyone knows Ramses II, Ramses the Great, Prince of Egypt, Sesi B'Demil, the 10 Commandments. Like, he's usually the one who's taken to be what is it called? The Pharaoh of the Exodus, the Yetziat Mitzrayim? Maybe, maybe not. There's many good reasons to say yes. There's a few significant reasons to say no. I'm not going into all the reasons. I'll just point out that if it is Ramses the Great, you can run into certain problems about the chronology, about when exactly was the building of the first temple, 480 years from the Exodus. Do you crunch those years into 200? It gets complicated. I'm just going to say that one of the other options is the Pharaoh of is this pharaoh, I mean, this is Amenhotep III, but his father, Amenhotep II, may possibly, perhaps, could have been the pharaoh of the Exodus, according to some opinions as well. In any event, so here we are. I want you to take a look at the bottom here. You see all these people, I enlarged it, who are on the very bottom. Now, you know that they weren't midgets, right? What is the point of making them so tiny and Pharaoh so big? Right? I think it goes without saying that this is trying to make the Pharaoh the big and the most important and impressive and glorious, right? This is propaganda. These people, again, we mentioned that the Egyptians don't do portraits. What they do is sort of like stereotypes. So here's a Nubian, and here's a Libyan, and here's a Babylonian, but it doesn't matter. They're all captives and slaves underneath the feet of the mighty big Pharaoh who rules them all, and they're all bowing down to him. Now, some of you may have heard a very famous midrash that says that Pharaoh was like a midget. We actually have found the mummy of Ramses the Great. It's in the museum in Cairo. He's 6 feet tall. He's not a midget. And the pharaohs generally weren't small. Like, you know, people were like 5'2", 5'1", maybe 5'4". Why was he called a midget? Well, it's making fun of him, because you can see how the pharaohs made themselves so big. And when you want to make fun of the pharaoh, you're not such hot stuff as you think, okay? Now let's take a look at the pharaoh himself. I like to talk about body language when we talk about people in antiquity, okay? So in antiquity, the way people conveyed messages by making statues and monuments and pictures, they try to present themselves in a certain way, right? So they'll make themselves look the way they want to be perceived. And as you know, history is written by the victor, whoever victor was. And so this is what they made. They wanted people to see themselves this way. So he made himself big. Now, look at the body language, okay? The body language tells you tons. Even if you don't speak the language, and that's the point of body language in antiquity, the body language will tell you a lot, okay? So look how he's sitting down. You see how he's sitting kind of like a bodybuilder. He's like flexing his muscles, sitting there, right? He's strong, and he's holding these staffs of kingship and government and rulership. I'm going to explain some of them. In his right hand, he's holding a kind of looped cross, which is called Ankh, which means life. So for example, King Tut is short for Tut Ankh Amun, which has to do with the god Amun, who we'll talk about later as well. So Tut Ankh Amun. Ankh means life, and the Egyptian gods and pharaohs had the life in their right hand. They control the power of life. And now that I mention it, I'm sure you'll notice Ankh in a lot of places as we go. In his right hand side, he also has a mace, which is a stick with a ball on top of it, which would usually be made of stone. You smash enemies on their head with it, and we're going to see that when we go to the temple of Abu Simbel. He's holding also the staffs of rulership and government. So he basically has a lot of different offices, kind of like certain prime ministers we may have heard of. The woman behind him, or actually to his right, it's just about like the 3D and 2 dimension. She's actually to his right. The woman behind him is none other than his mother. And that is important because in Egyptian belief, not any person can become a pharaoh, because the pharaoh is a royal bloodline of demigods, of people who are born human and become gods after they die. So you can't just become a usurper to the throne, right? It kind of protects you. When you think about it, you have to have a royal blood claim. This is his mother. It's the bloodline. It's the legitimacy. It's the power behind the throne, literally, right? So, so here we are. Here is the pharaoh, and he's also wearing a hat which is actually called the blue crown for a very creative reason. It's blue. The blue crown is the crown that the pharaohs wear going into battle, which is what they did half of the year. They were expanding their territory in the country and defending the borders, right? Asserting their power. So this is really very much a lot about the pharaohs, okay? So this really kind of gives us a glimpse into the pharaohs. And on that note, what I'd like to do, what is this? We're going to be going into the museum again. Okay. Now, I just want to point out if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to write in the chat. I'm going to see if there's any questions. Okay. Jaime Betesh, are you the only one seeing the desktop very small? I don't know. This should be on full screen. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Is everybody seeing this? Thumbs up if you see this in full screen. Yeah, everybody seems to be seeing this in full screen. So I don't know what it's there, but I hope you are able to resolve it. Okay, so let's move along into the museum. Okay, I'll show you a few more stuff. These paintings, it's kind of cool. You get a glimpse into the past because some of these have changed. They're not here anymore. Things have moved. Oh, here's Isis. We'll talk about Isis as well. A lot of cool stuff to see. Okay, so let's move on. Now, here's a really cool thing. On the left-hand side of this room, we're now entering a period in Egyptian Egyptian culture, which is called the Ptolemaic dynasty. This is when the Greeks, the generals of Alexander and their descendants, ruled Egypt. On the left-hand side is a long roll of papyrus, which is called a book, the Book of the Dead. I'm going to go into that in a bit. On the right-hand side, this is no longer here. Like, I never saw this in my life because I came to New York in 2014, and this is from 2010. So there's an exhibit here, a display that I have never seen before, and I was not able to explore it right now. But this is kind of cool. You see rolls of linen, you see papyrus, and all kinds of other cool stuff. Oh, this stuff is actually still there, but it's in a different case right now. They've moved it around. But this is all Ptolemaic. So kind of cool, right? All right. But we're going to focus on this large book, the Book of the Dead. We're going to talk about mummies. So this Book of the Dead, we're going to go into a lot more detail. I just want you to see this little scene over here, which we're going to visit again and again. There's a seated, wrapped up, mummified Egyptian god who's known as Osiris. We're going to talk about him soon. And this is, one second. And this is a scene which is called the weighing of the heart and in the judgment of Osiris. We're going to talk about this a lot, so you're going to see this soon. But the importance of this papyrus is that this is basically an Egyptian manual for the dead. In other words, after a person dies, their soul is supposed to live forever, and we're going to talk about that. And the whole purpose of the soul, of preserving the body, is so that the soul can go into the afterlife. And in the afterlife, there's a series of tests and trials that you have to go through. It's very complicated. And so if there's one thing you need to know is how to read. So as a soul, you can read these instructions and make your way into the afterlife, okay? So we're gonna go into depth into this in just a moment, all right? But this is a very, very famous text in ancient Egypt. But I wanna talk about mummies, okay? So this mummy over here is actually a mummy I have a family connection to, and I kid you not, and I wanna tell you the story. So let's move up close to see him. These cases, these wooden and stone cases, are the cases that contain the mummy. We're going to see more about that soon. This mummy over here is actually a Greek. Just like we saw Roman mummies in the beginning, this is a Greek mummy. And the mummy's name is Nesmin. Now, we've opened up many mummies in the past. I mean, when Carter found King Tut was opened up. He was unwrapped, and those wraps which were meant to protect the body were no longer able to protect the body, and so the air damaged the skin, even though it's been very well scanned and documented, and you can know a lot about it. Ramses the Great was also opened up. Many mummies were opened up, and when you open them up, you damage the skin. You simply damage them, right? So what do you do about it? So the ancient Egyptians were able to preserve the body by drying out the fluids of the body, which takes like 40 to 70 days, and they would soak these linens in resin, and Egypt was a major producer of linen, of pishtim. They actually later on imported cotton and started growing it, and Egyptian cotton is so famous because they still hand pick it as opposed to using machines. But it's not a native plant. It's not an indigenous plant to Egypt. Egypt uses linen. And they sort of wrapped the dead, and we're going to go into that in a bit. Now, this preserved the body. Now, this mummy has never been opened up. It's a Greek guy named Nesmin, but he's never been opened up, and that's because we don't need to open them up anymore. There's modern techniques for studying mummies, and that's called radiology. You simply use radiology. You put them through a scanner, an MRI, and then with that imaging, you can unwrap it digitally and look at the skin and reconstruct the face, and then look at the bones and look at the bone structure. And guys, there's a lot you can learn from the bone structure, from the integrity. You can even do CSI, like try to figure out the cause of death. Did he fall? Was he shot in battle? Was he stabbed in the back? Shot by an arrow, by a sword, broken bones? There's a lot of things you can know about them without opening them up. Now, how do I know? What's my family connection to this mummy? My cousin, Dr. Hoffman, is the radiologist, one of the radiologists on the NYU team who scanned this mummy. So I actually have in my email some photos of the scan. But today, in 2020, you can see those pictures here on the wall. So you don't really need, you need those emails. You can just stand and see the images of the x-ray. It's not here today. You're not going to see it now, Linda. Sorry. Okay, so let's talk about mummies. Okay, where are we? Oh, some of the stuff has changed. We're now looking through the ghost of a person. We're going to see a lot of cool stuff here. Let's see. Okay. Okay. If ever there was a romantic way to be buried, this is it. This is a mummy. It's a little bit hard to see from here, but you can see that it's very wide. That's because it contained a couple side by side. Kind of, well, you know, okay. Let's move on. And we're going to talk about mummies and the dead and the afterlife. So this room, this entire room, we're going to walk into it, contains remains from a period of Egypt, which is alongside the middle to the end of the first temple period, Kufat Beit Rishon, the time of Chizkiyahu and so on, King Hezekiah. This is what's called the 26th dynasty, or the late dynasty. I'm not going to that right now, but I want to point out this mummy. So look at this. It kind of looks like these pieces of a sarcophagus are hovering. I'd like you to think of the Russian Matryoshka doll, where you have a doll inside a doll inside a doll inside a doll. That's how Egyptians protected the bodies. And so the innermost coffin here has the mummy inside it. We'll see a real one in just a moment, well, digital. And there's a case covered by another case covered by another case, which has this protective jackal or wild dog on top of it. That's Anubis. We'll talk about that soon. So this mummy, this is how they preserved the body. Now, why did they do that? Let's remember. The Egyptian belief was that after the body decays, after the person dies, and that is, the soul has two different parts, the ka and the ba. One of them is the spirit, the force of life. The other one is the person's identity themselves, okay? That doesn't really matter for us right now, but what matters is that in order for those spirits to be able to continue to visit the world and to live on, you need to do one thing and do it well. You need to preserve the body. And that's where the whole concept of mummies came from. They dried out the bodies with salts, which were found like a natron salt. There's actually a place called Lake Natron. It's like a place where they have natron. They would dry out the skin and protect it, and all these layers of protection really serve them in the long run because the body is protected, and so the soul can live forever. And that's really important because if you want to go through the judgment of Osiris and into the afterworld, your body needs to be preserved. So you better have an endowment. Now, let's look at some stuff that they buried. This down here is a pet. It's a dried out pet. You can sort of see its legs, its head, a little gazelle. They mummified their pets, they mummified their jewelry, they mummified anything that they wanted to sort of take with them into the afterlife. And as long as your body's preserved, well, it works, right? Now, here's something cool about mummies. So this mummy here, there's the mummy lying down. I lay down next to her, so she's about 5'1", 5'2". I'm like a head and a half taller than it, but you can lay down that next to it. That's the actual body. There you go. And here's the case it was inside. But that case was inside another case, which was inside another case, which was inside another case. And this case was burned by a fire. But luckily it was preserved. Why? Because of these extreme precautions that they took to preserve the body. So it really served them in the long run. So you're looking at this is an effect in how these customs preserved the body and saved it, so that even if there was a fire, a collapse, or damage, or something happened, they believed that the soul can keep on living, and so you'd be able to you know, do what you got to do in the afterlife. Okay, good. Now this is of course the Book of the Dead. We're going to see more of them. These are little statues called ushabtis or shawabtis, which are these little prayer statuettes which you would bring into the tomb in order to communicate with the dead. So it's sort of like, so to speak, yes, and I mean this lahavdil, when you bring a note to the kotel, to the western wall, and put it there, which is kind of like a modern custom, it's like saying, I want my prayer to stay there when I leave. So people would bring these little Shabti statues, and you can even see places where there's boxes and boxes and boxes full of them. Here's another one with different cases and tons of them staying inside there because people would come to visit all the time. Wow, this is a really nice, colorful Book of the Dead, except the resolution isn't so good, but we're going to see some better ones in just a moment. All right, so let's move on. More and more coffins and the Book of the Dead. This Book of the Dead is a Book of the Dead where I want to sort of introduce Egyptian mythology and to really take you a little bit more into the stories behind the mythology so that we can appreciate what was going on with the 10 plagues and the Exodus, and to sort of understand how the representation of ancient Egypt in the Torah and Tanakh in the Bible is really gives you an insight into Egyptian mentality and what it means to be in Egypt. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. So I'm going to quote two different places from Maat Bechorot, from the 10th plague of the death of the firstborn. But when this is happening, so I'm sure you've heard these references. We're all sitting at home during the pandemic. Unfortunately, there was lockdown, and people, especially in Jerusalem, like, they were very, very careful not to let anybody out of their home because they're worried that large family gatherings are going to spread the virus, God forbid. And so there's these analogies that have been popping up with all of the amazing, rich, dark humor about all of the situation, saying it's the first time in 3,300 years that during Passover night, nobody's allowed to leave their home, right? This was the first time it happened. And it's the death of the plague of the firstborn, Maat Bechorot. Now, why can't you go outside? Because God is outside, and anybody who's outside can get killed, right? And what it says is as follows. God saying, I will personally pass through Egypt on this night. I will strike all of the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man to beast. And I'm going to mete out punishments, or literally judge all of the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. Now you can ask yourself, what is the purpose? What is God trying to achieve by sort of pandering to the Egyptian mythology, right? We're going to explore this. It's really, really important to understand. But first of all, let's meet the happy family. So we're going to go into this in pieces, parts for now for the Book of the Dead and parts for later for when we visit Abu Simbel in Nubia. I'm going to go into them. I'm going to enlarge these so you don't have to worry too much about their size now. We're going to go into each one of these, okay? So let's go into it, okay? So first of all, we're going to go into this more. So rest assured, we're getting back to this. Osiris, the god of the underworld. So Osiris is the couple of Isis. I'm going to move back one more time. Moving back. Isis and Osiris. You can see on the top left, you have Ra or Re. Egyptian, by the way, ancient Egyptian doesn't have vowels. It just has consonants, kind of like Hebrew, right? In Hebrew, if you don't have nikudot, you don't know how to read the word. So ancient Egyptian actually has consonants, and there's sort of like an accepted way to read ancient Egyptian in modern scholarship, but we really don't know. So it's just Ra. So it can be Re or Ra or Re. We don't know. And this is true for pretty much every Egyptian pronunciation, more or less, except for, Coptic, which is a later form of it mixed with Greek, kind of can give you an indication of how to pronounce ancient Egyptian. Anyway, so that's why Ra is sometimes Ra and sometimes Re. That's the important part. So we have the sun god Ra, some of his children, Isis and Osiris and Set. On the bottom, there's two more, but that doesn't matter. Isis and Osiris are siblings, but in Egyptian, mythology, gods marry siblings. This is not unique to Egypt. And their son is Horus on the bottom left. We'll get to him much later. And that's all we need to know for now, other than that little monster, Ammut or Ammit. We're going to talk about him and a few other ones. So here's Osiris. Osiris, who is the son of Ra, who is the brother and husband of Isis, who is a sorceress and has the power of resurrection. It's going to be important later. So this is Osiris. Now Osiris's power is he's the god of the underworld. You notice that he's green? That's because he's dead. You can kind of imagine, what was it? Beetlejuice, where you see these dead people and they're all green, right? He's dead. But he has the pharaoh's hat, but it's like a god's hat. It's called an atef. And he's wrapped up, embalmed in linens because he's like a mummy. He's the god of the underworld. And on the left hand is kind of like fan art. And of course, he's the one in charge of the underworld. So if you want to get in there to go into his kingdom, you have to stand the what's called the judgment of Osiris. So this is all just building blocks to be able to go in depth into that Book of the Dead, which we earlier saw. We're going to go into it in depth, okay? Anubis. Anubis is the jackal or a dog. He's the god of the dead, not the god of the underworld, the god of death itself. He's responsible for the transition between life and death. He's the one who rules it. Now, in ancient Egyptian mythology, that's why dogs, remember there was a dog on top of the coffin, right? Dogs are very, very important in ancient Egypt in association with death. These aren't poodles that we're talking about. These are jackals. These are wild dogs which live in the outskirts of the city and are constantly involved with death, where the mummies are. I mean, where death is always, cemeteries are always outside the city, right? So that's kind of their connection. Now, side note, in the 10th plague, I'm quoting another verse, is that when the 10th plague is happening, God specifically refers to the dog in a very interesting way. He says, so as this happens, it's just the next verse. Not a single dog will snarl or stick its tongue out or make a sound at the people, the children of Israel, nor to man or beast. Why? The purpose of dogs being utterly silent during the death of the firstborn is that everyone will know that God differentiates between Egypt and between Israel, between who shall live and who shall die. God is responsible for God and death, not Anubis. And how do you see this? I'm quoting Dr. Yael Ziegler, who told me this in the museum, is that when all of the dogs are silent, the Egyptians get the message that the dog has nothing to do with it. Anubis is not involved in death. Where there's death everywhere, you're of course expecting dogs to celebrate, right? And that doesn't happen, which means that it's teaching them a lesson. So it's really important because it's trying to show you the Egyptians like a different mindset. We're going to explore this a little bit more. I just want you to see that's the Anubis, and we're moving on. So another goddess which we need to recognize is, her name is Maat or Maat. Now Maat is the goddess or God, the goddess of balance and cosmic order. Very, very important. So number one, she's important for us for the Book of the Dead, but number two, she's also important to understand the Pharaoh, Paro. So her symbol, look at her. This is typical Egyptian goddess. They all look exactly the same. The only difference is what's on top of their head, okay? So what's on her head is the ostrich feather. Now just imagine, right? I'm holding a pen, but imagine this being an ostrich's feather, right? What would it take to balance an ostrich feather? Just to perfectly balance it. It's impossible. And this is exactly the point, because a perfectly balanced, gigantic ostrich feather is the manifestation, the representation, the embodiment of balance and cosmic order. And this is the goddess Maat. And every single pharaoh's job, role in the world was to maintain order and balance in the cosmos, which means that the pharaoh's role is justice. And he is considered to be divine justice and responsible for cosmic order and balance, which is going to be very, very important for understanding the challenges for him to accept responsibility for subjugating the Hebrews as a bad thing, because he's the pharaoh, right? Here's another image of Maat, okay? Let's just take one more. So this is called Ammut the Devourer, or Ammut. Again, we don't have vowels in ancient Egyptian. So Ammut the Devourer, you see him here, this is fan art, is like the pet of Anubis. Ammut the Devourer, he's like a mixture of three different monstrous, like dangerous beings. The front of his mouth is a crocodile. His front is a lion. Sometimes it's a leopard, and the back is a hippopotamus. Now, hippopotami are actually very dangerous beings. These are the three biggest human killers in all of Egypt, and different parts of Egypt, of course. The crocodiles and the hippos live in the Nile, and the lions are in the desert part. But these are all monsters. Now, why is this important to us? This is just a side point. It's really cute. I learned this from my friend Rafi Zerum, that Arov, the plague of the fourth plague, the plague of wild beasts, could mean two things. It could either mean a mixture, a horde of wild animals, or it can mean a wild animal, which is a mixture. Because the word Arov in Hebrew means mixture, like Erev, evening, means like when the day blends into the night, where things are kind of like murky, or like Ta'arovet, La'arbev, Buvia. The word Arov means mixture. So if this could be like God sort of like sending the Egyptian boogie monster against them and kind of like torturing them with that concept. It's like their nightmares coming alive, eating them. It's a cool idea. Okay, now let's look back at that Book of the Dead, which we are just standing in front of in the Met when we're looking at those mummies. So this is the judgment of Osiris. Here's Osiris on the right. He's the god of the dead, as we saw. There's Anubis. Anubis is, of course, the god who's responsible for life and death. And so you have a scale. This is called the weighing of the heart. On the left-hand side is the heart of who? Well, you notice that repetitive character, that female who's on the top all over, and on the left, that's her. So this belonged to a female mummy, and this is her instructions about what she needs to do in order to make her way into the kingdom of Osiris, okay? So on the left hand is a jar with her heart, and it's being weighed against Maat. You see there's the little sitting figure of Maat with the feather on her head, and she has the ankh in her hands, or on her knees. This is weighing the heart against judgment. And one of the things that the dead needed to say is, I have never stolen and I have not murdered, etc. You're being weighed in terms of your behavior, your justice, in order to be able to move into the underworld. So this is very important to ancient Egyptians. Now, here's the verse that I'm putting on the top is actually from the end of Makat Barad, from the seventh plague, the plague of hailstones, in which the Pharaoh reached a breakthrough moment where he is able to recognize that he has done wrong, as opposed to being sort of scared by the God of Israel into doing what he doesn't want to do. He's now accepting responsibility. And so the Pharaoh calls Moshe, and he says, he calls Moses and Aaron and says, I have sinned this time. I recognize my fault. Hashem HaTzadik v'ani v'ani HaRashayim. God is righteous and me and my people are wicked. Whoa. I mean, the Pharaoh, who's the ruler of everything, is like a god, and he shall accept moral responsibility. This is, ladies and gentlemen, this is progress. We're getting there. 7 out of 10 steps, and it's still going to take longer than that. But this is part of the point. These gradual steps, the 10 plagues, I call them a 10-step therapy session, in which the Pharaoh is able to gradually, and the Egyptians are gradually weaned from their worldview to be able to see something else. It doesn't happen overnight. To quote Jack Nicholson, you can't handle the truth, right? It takes time to accept truth. It can't just happen overnight. Now, one more thing. Here's another Book of the Dead. We sort of passed by it on the side. I showed you. I'm pointing out this one because here you can see the monster on the right-hand side. Let's look at this again. Again, the Book of the Dead is the most popular book in ancient Egypt. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. All right, so you're going to see variations. So you have Anubis over here weighing the heart. On the right-hand side, you have the feather, the ostrich feather of of Maat, and on the left-hand side, the jar with the heart. And what happens if your heart's too heavy? Let's note, if your heart's too heavy, having a heavy heart means wicked, which is really cool. Because as you'll note, and I put the verse here on the top, God says to Moses, I have heavied his heart. Kaved doesn't mean harden, even though he does say in other places, I will harden. But the point is, in Egyptian lingo, when you say a heavy heart, you mean evil and wicked. Now, what happens when your heart's too heavy? You don't make it into the afterworld because your heart's going to be gobbled up by Ammut, who in this case is actually part leopard, on the right-hand side. So that monster will gobble up your heart. So you do not want to have a heavy heart, right? Okay, this is going to be where we're going to be going next, but I'm going to take you back into the museum, and our next stop is going to be the Temple of Dendur. This time I can show you, if some of you have been with me in the Met Temple of Dendur, this time I'm going to show you some stuff which I could not show you when I was in the museum. So here we go. Temple of Dendur. Look at all this cool stuff. There's a blue crown, right? This is actually a pillar of Ramses the Great. Not going to talk about that now, but you know, we have some stuff from him in the museum. All right. We are in what's called the Sackler Gallery. Those of you who are following current events, actually this isn't so current now because of the pandemic, but you know, the whole opioid crisis and all that stuff. So there's a big question if the Sacklers are going to be able to keep their name on the gallery. Museums are sort of, they don't like the name because of their connection with the opioid industry, but that's another story. So this is replicating where the Nile would have been. This is because this was rescued, of course. We're not actually in Egypt. But let's take a look at this. So we're going along the Nile. Now, no, we're not going to go into that room. All right. All of these pieces on the left, by the way, are called telatats. Telata in Arabic is 3. Wahad tinin telata. These are 3 handbreadths wide, so they're called telatats. These are pieces of, remember I mentioned there was a king, Amenhotep IV, who became known as Akhenaten. So I said he was despised. So everything he built was sort of carved and chopped up and reused. So we kind of have fragments of his stuff. That's kind of related to him, just a fun fact. Temple of Dendur. This is from 2010. If you've been with me in the museum, you know that right here is actually a little statue of a crocodile. It's not here, so we're not going to talk about crocodiles. But this is really the cool part. Let's climb up. Climb up. What just happened? Okay. So this temple is a really cool temple. It's the only temple outside of ancient Egypt. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And what's important about this temple is 2 things. Number one, it tells us about Egyptian temples and monuments, which we're going to do firsthand in the place it was taken from. But also, it kind of gives you a glimpse into propaganda. So this temple was, you can't go in here in Google Street View. You can't get in, unfortunately. but inside this chamber is a statue of whatever the god or goddess is of this particular temple in. And what's really cool is this image on the side. So this image, hold on. It's going to be a little bit hard to get there, but it's all right. It's not that critical. So you have a figure of a pharaoh over here. Now you really can't see it, it's blurry. A pharaoh who's sort of giving gifts to these gods. And that's not important. We're going to see more of this inside with Ramses the Great. So what's going on here, let me just see if there's, okay, we're good. I'm just checking if there's any questions. Okay, we're good. So this temple was actually built in honor of a Roman emperor who ruled Egypt. And that is, of course, the first Roman emperor, Octavian, or AKA Augustus, who gave us the month of August, because he had to outdo his uncle, who was Julius Caesar was July. So in any event, this was built in order to show loyalty to the Roman emperor. And the Roman empire was pretty liberal in terms of worship. They're just like, you know, do whatever it is that you do, just honor Caesar. So how would you do that in this case? Well, you build a temple honoring the pharaoh or the Roman emperor, and you bring offerings, and that was fine. So this is actually contemporary of the end of the Bai Chini of the Second Temple. And the reason the pharaoh there is actually Augustus, the reason it looks like a pharaoh, it's because when in Rome, act like a Roman, and when a Roman ruling Egypt, act like an Egyptian. So you kind of have to look the part. So forgive me for a moment. I'm just going to say, if you're a Roman, well, act like an Egyptian. Can't find my Egyptian rubber ducky. This is Cleopatra. Anyway, I use these in the museum. Those of you who know, it's just for fun. It's not a real pharaoh, it's a quack. Okay, that's all the puns for today. So let's talk about this. So here, you can actually stand outside it. So the story of this monument actually has to do with some of the greatest industrial operations in ancient Egypt. And that has to do with the temple of Ramses in Abu Simbel. Let's go and see it. So this is it, okay? This is the temple of Abu Simbel, is the temple of the sun. And you're seeing the seated pharaohs. Now you notice here that the conical hats, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. This is all Ramses the Great. Well, this is a picture. And this is what I was able to do until now. But from now, ladies and gentlemen, I can take you in there. So let's go. We're going to go along the Nile, and we're going to go to Abu Simbel. Down the Nile. See, the Nile goes down and down and down. Now we're already inside Sudan, in Nubia, and that's the point. This was actually built by the pharaohs in Nubia, which they were not able to control, but which they constantly had issues with, and they wanted to show them who's boss. So they made these massive temples in Egypt, in Nubia, to kind of show them who's the boss. Okay, second, Abu Simbel. Here, let's do this. Here we go. Boom. Okay, you know what? Here we go. This is going to take you straight there instead of wasting your time. So this is the temple in Abu Simbel. We're looking at it at street view. Now, we're going to walk into it in just a moment. So you're going to really enjoy it. This is his queen. And we're going to see all of this stuff very soon. Now, here's the really cool thing. This is incredible. And I saw some footage of this on YouTube. It's incredible to see it. You see where the Nile is right now? The Nile was actually much, 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 much lower. And this temple was actually much lower. And in the 1960s, when the Egyptian government built the Aswan Dam, which is in Aswan, it's basically in Sudan, everything south of that, which is upper along the Nile, right, where the Nile comes from, overflowed and damaged a lot of monuments. And so the Temple of Dendur was actually rescued from actually being flooded because they were rescuing these Egyptian monuments, right? So the Temple of Dendur, this is part of an international operation by UNESCO. It took like 50 different countries to be involved in this. And the United States were given a gift, the temple, which they rescued, to put inside New York. This temple, this is in a mountain, okay? Now get this, ladies and gentlemen. This was actually cut up into 1,600 pieces and taken up to the top of the mountain, and the bottom was flooded. This entire massive thing was moved. But not only was it moved, it was put in the exact same direction to the sun, so the exact same thing can happen as we can see. Now, I'd like to take us further inside, or to kind of explore a few things about it. I'm going to go to the slideshow in a minute, but this is really critical that we understand. Look how small the person is. We're going to see this guy smiling at us when we move up forward. Look how small even this massive statue is. The Pharaoh is overpowering, towering above us, massive, impressive, important. And that's kind of the message of the ancient pharaohs. So moving in. Okay, moving in. So we're going to take a look. So look at all these slaves. All of these slaves, this is the name of Ramesses the Great. Ramesses, he has several different names, epithets, but this is his name. You're seeing all kinds of things going on. These are slaves tied with their hands behind their back and tied around their neck. There's a Babylonian, there's a Nubian. All of these people are underneath the Pharaoh, crushed by him, small and insignificant. That's really the point of all of this, right? To kind of send this message. Now let's go further in. This guy's smiling at us. I saw him many times today. Okay, let's go into the temple, shall we? Look at these massive statues. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Crowns of Upper Egypt, crowns of Lower Egypt. This is the double crown, okay? Now, I'm gonna take you into several different parts here, okay? But I want you to look around so you can kind of get a sense. So I want you to see it. Here's the Pharaoh serving offerings in front of the god Ammon, the hidden one, right? And other things going on here. There's images of the Pharaoh doing things, right? Here's his servants. Let me see if I can move into here. Okay, good. Excellent. This is the most inner chamber. We jump through a wall, but that's Google Street View. We kind of jump through a wall. Now, the whole point of this, here is Ramesses the Great, right there in the middle with his blue crown, surrounded by different gods. There's Horus, there's Ammon, and I can't tell. This is probably Osiris because his hands are together, but I'm not sure. Now the sun rises, and exactly at sunrise, the sun hits the face of Ramesses the Great and lights him up. And therefore it's called the Temple of the Sun, Abu Simbel. It's really, really important to recognize that this whole thing is meant to show Ramesses the Great as shining, as the son of Ra or Re, with the rays of the sun hitting him. And there is a solar boat, we'll talk about in a moment. And there's all these offerings. Here's the Pharaoh bringing offerings and libations. You see he's pouring libations, what's called nesachim. You can see that people carved graffiti on it. It says 1940 something. Not sure if it's 1948, doubt it. Can't tell that number. But anyway, yeah, you see these graffitis. People just who visit carved on it, wrote their names on it. But this is the Pharaoh bringing offerings before the gods, right? Because he's the most important and he's the greatest, yeah? Let's move into this wall. This is great. So here is the Pharaoh commanding all these different people. And here's the Pharaoh's servants carrying the solar boat. Now this boat, actually, they believe that when the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, that the sun is like the sun god Ra, which travels in a boat across the sky and then sinks into the Duat, into the underworld, the realm of Osiris, and then comes back up into the sky the next day. So this whole point of having a boat is sort of like the solar boat. It's like your soul can also travel across the sky. So these are all the things that you need in order to make sure that the soul sort of lives on and does what it needs to do. Okay, I want to show you some war scenes. Let's see if I can get it in here. This is really incredible, the amount of things that you can see here. The massive, just imagine walking into here and seeing this thing in full color, all these winged gods on top and falcons and statues. It's like, it really, really humbles you about who Pharaoh is. And if you can read the hieroglyphics, all these different stories. Oh, that's a very important picture, but I'm gonna try to get a better one. Here we are. I was speaking about this. So look at this. This is a servant of Ramesses. Here's Ramesses the Great. I just don't want to walk through a wall because this is a bit of a tricky place. So here's Ramesses the Great on his chariot, holding a bow and arrow, while holding the reins to the horse, to the chariot, tied around to his waist, which is obviously impossible. Like if you're going into battle, you're obviously going to have somebody holding the reins while you shoot. But again, this is propaganda. This is trying to show the Pharaoh as the greatest. So this is war. Now Pharaoh Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, was by far the most important and successful Pharaoh in all of Egypt's history. Okay, he had massive conquests, the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, and so on and so forth. So he's glorifying everything that he achieved here with these massive monuments and statues. And this one is built in Sudan. It's not even in Egypt, right? I mean, it's in Nubia. But he's trying to tell them, look how powerful I am, Pharaoh, the Pharaoh God. So here he is on his chariot. Here's some of his servants stepping on top of the face of their enemies and smiting them. This is a servant. This isn't the Pharaoh, but you get the point, because you're going to see more and more of these pharaohs everywhere smiting their enemies. Now, what I want to show you here, wait, it kind of disappeared. Hang on. So we speak here, I'm just going to enlarge it. So this is Pharaoh, right? You see he's wearing a crown. This is not the crown that he wears in battle, but here he's actually holding a mace in his left hand. It's usually in his right hand, but that's kind of cool. And he's holding, it's a little bit hard to see in this angle, but he's holding all by the hair, the heads of all of his enemies, and he's about to smash their heads in with that mace. And so he's showing himself as powerful, right? And so you talk about Pharaoh, you talk about Pharaoh's right hand smiting his enemies, right? That's usually what you'd see. It's usually going to be the right hand side. This is kind of an anomaly. So when you talk about God's outstretched hand, it's sort of like using Egyptian lingo to talk about Egypt, right? So this is kind of showing you a glimpse into what's inside the temples. Now I want to show you more than that. I'm not done with the temple, but in order to do that, I want to go a little bit into mythology. So let's talk a little bit more about the Pharaoh. Okay, so we've seen this, and now we're going to talk about the relationship between the Pharaoh and the god Horus, because this is going to be very, very important to understand the idea of Pharaoh. And then I'm going to sort of summarize that with one more idea, and I hope we're going to have time for one more stop in ancient Egypt. Okay, so here's Horus the Avenger. So the basic story that you need to know about Horus the Avenger and why he's called the Avenger and how that's related to the Pharaoh and the ruler of both lands, I'm going to explain all that. So first of all, to the left we have Ra, right, or Re. He's the sun god Ra. In Egyptian mythology, the god Ra is like one of the primal gods. He sort of became the ruler of ancient Egypt as a pharaoh human god, sort of. And he had a bunch of children, right? Some of them married each other, some of them killed each other, a lot of fun. So I'm going to introduce you to three out of five of his important children, according to some of the versions. The mythology has a lot of different versions, okay? From left to right, Isis and Osiris and Seth. Now, Isis is the sorceress who has the power of resurrection. Osiris is not the god of the underworld yet. That only happens after he's murdered by his jealous brother, Set, who's like the god of chaos and the deserts and stuff like that. It's not even clear what animal he is. It's like this weird creature. It looks to me like an anteater, but I don't think that's what he is. Now look, they all look the same. They just have different things that they're holding in their hands and on their head, right? So Isis and Osiris get married, and they have one child whose name is Horus, or Hor, actually. The Greeks called him Horus. It's just Hor. So the god Horus is the falcon god. That means if he's a bird, that means it's a sky god, okay, like related to the sun. So they have a son, Horus. Now Set's very jealous. He wants to rule the throne. And I'm going to reference here a very famous cartoon I'm sure you know about. It's called The Lion King. Very, very similar story. You have Mufasa, who's the ruler of Pride Rock, and his jealous brother Scar kills him, attempts to kill the son, who's the heir to the throne, who is Simba. Simba runs away. Scar thinks he's dead. And then Simba comes back and avenges his father and regains control. Now let's copy paste that onto ancient Egypt, okay? Seth kills Osiris, tries to kill Horus, who's the heir to the throne. Horus escapes. Seth thinks that Horus is dead. Horus comes back and fights against Seth, his uncle, just like Scar, and kills him, right? And then he becomes the ruler of ancient Egypt. So this is Egyptian mythology. Now here's what's important. Osiris is resurrected. Remember that Isis has the power of resurrection, but because he's now dead, he becomes the ruler of the underworld. And so we have the judgment of Osiris. Horus comes back, and he's actually in the world of the dead. He's sort of like dead and not dead, and he's trained by his father. Think sort of like Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi training Luke Skywalker to go and face Darth Vader, but little does he know that Darth Vader is his father, but here he knows exactly that Seth is his uncle. So he goes and he prepares to fight against, and he goes, and it takes actually 80 years until he defeats his sneaky uncle. So when he goes back and defeats his uncle, Horus becomes the ruler of the underworld and the world above. In other words, he's the ruler of both worlds. Now look at his crown. He has the double crown of Egypt, the ruler of both lands. And so Pharaoh and Horus are synonymous. And this is very, very important, okay? Let me see. So you see on the bottom left of Horus's feet is the famous Wedjat eye, or the eye of Horus. The eye of Horus, you all know this, I'm sure you've seen it, it's pictures, it's very famous. It actually has a lot to do with this mythology, because in the mythology, Horus the Avenger, when he fights against his uncle, loses his eye. He loses his eye. And his eye is eventually magically restored by the god of wisdom, who's actually an ibis bird named Thot, or in English Thoth, but it's really Thot. So Thoth restores his eye. But the point is that he loses his sight in the battle. And that's, by the way, he's holding a traditional Egyptian sword, by the way. We found some of them. So what happens here now is that he avenges his uncle after losing his eye. And so this eye represents like the magically restored eye and vision and sight. And so in Egyptian coffins, they would place the eye of Horus on the side of the coffin where the dead's face was facing, so he can sort of see into the real world. So this is kind of cool, and that's what he does. Okay, we're going to get back to these models in a moment, but now I'd like to take you back to ancient Egypt. So now that we've seen this, we see that I want you to see here's the sun god Ra, but I want you to see these representations of the pharaoh related to Horus, because that's really, really important in Egyptian mythology. All right, is the connection to the Horus, because Pharaoh is basically the ruler of both worlds. And there was an image of there's Horus, right there, like the sun god. It's sometimes Ra, sometimes it's Horus. But the point is that the Pharaoh is synonymous with Horus, and after he dies, he becomes kind of like Horus. Okay, so I'm going to take you outside of this. We've been inside here for a while. I want to just quickly show you the other monument of his queen. It's just kind of cool, right? Take a look. There is a pharaoh, again, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. There's different goddesses. This can be, it could be Osiris, I'm not sure. Let's see if you can go inside, see if we recognize anything. Here we're inside. Oh, wow, this is really, really cool. These on the side are the goddess called Chatho, or Hathor, who's related to the golden calf. She's like the motherly golden cow of love and affection and so on. Really cool stuff. I'm really going to go back into the museum. I just kind of want to show you what's inside her because it's cool. There's the god Ra, Amun, the hidden one. There is Hathor, Chatho, like the golden cow. Did we just walk through a wall? No. This is actually related to the golden calf, but we don't have too much time to talk about it. But it's kind of cool. She's on the sun boat. She's like the sun. She travels around the sky. Cool stuff. There is the goddess Hathor in human form, so to speak, with Ankh, with the power of life in her hand. And here, I guess they're sort of crowning the goddess. So you have Chatho crowning the queen as a sort of like, I guess she sort of was resurrected as a, like, kind of like Pharaoh becomes Horus, she becomes a goddess or something. I don't know. Oh, that's the god Ptah, who's one of the most ancient creation gods. But anyway, you kind of get the sense of it. And on the bottom here, of course, you can see a lot of pictures that people took, a lot of fun here you can do. Okay. I'm going to end this part here. We're going to go back into the Met. So here we are in the Temple of Dendur. Okay, we're in the Temple of Dendur. We've seen it. It's kind of fun. I want to take you to another stop in the museum, but the Temple of Dendur is now seen in context. So some of you have been within the museum. You kind of realize where it came from and the magnitude of those operations. It's really, really important. Okay. You know what I'm going to do now instead, I'm going to do, you can get to learn a trick on this, by the way, is I want to drag and drop. I don't want to start just dragging myself through the museum. So I'm standing here. I kind of know where I want to go. I want to go here. Okay, no, I don't want to go here. I want to go here. Perfect. You got to know the museum. Okay, so this is our final stop in the Met. And then I'm going to take you to some other stuff. Now, I don't have that much time, but okay. So this is a room. I'm going to try to walk around it. It's a little difficult, but again, thanks to the Met's website, I have some high-resolution images of this. This is, it says there, ancient models from the tomb of Meket Re. Re, again, is the sun god, right? You want the protection of the sun god, so you put their name in your name, okay? So, so here we have the stuff that was found inside a tomb. Now, this is a tomb from the Old Kingdom. It's from the time of the pyramids. This is very, very ancient, and this stuff has survived. And the way that it survived is because it was buried underground, and it was found by accident 100 years ago to date, in the year 1920, when the Met was kind of surveying in Thebes, and what's called, there's all these little tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and they found an empty room because, of course, robbers knew that there's going to be treasures there, and they looted it, but they found this. Okay, this was a hidden room which the looters, the thieves, were not able to find. The thieves were not able to find. Okay, now all of these small models, these miniature models, I'm going to zoom into them in a bit, show you daily life in ancient Egypt. And the reason that they made these mini models is to sort of magically give power to the deceased to be able to continue living and do what he wants to do. So just like in life, he had an estate with cows and a granary, and they made bread and bakery, and they had boats, and they had their yachts and their luxury cruises, right? You're going to have the same thing after death because you have the magical power to do it by these little statues. So this is Mekitre, okay? Now, let's take a look at some of these models. Here's these little boats. You can see boats that also symbolize the travel from the life of like in the underworld, where you go through the sun going across the sky and then down into the underworld. So the boats traveling across the Nile is like a metaphor for the soul traveling into the underworld every day with the sun rising up and going under. So there's this connection between boats and the Nile and the sun traveling. It's really connected, okay? So all these little boats, and here's this little procession of people bearing offerings and gifts and beer and bread and towels. It looks like they're folded towels, like they're going to the shower or something. Okay, now let's take a close look at this, okay? It's a little bit hard to see, but I'm going to take you into this. So these are these little models. They're small, but they're original wood, original paint, original linen, original threads. It's really cool. Like they even found mouse droppings in there from mice came in to actually eat on the actual food because they put real food, grain, and also beer. They actually put beer in there. So there was a kind of an exploded can of beer that they found there. It's kind of cool. So these are the mini models. And on the left, you have cows. They ate meat. They ate a lot of meat. They ate geese. They ate ducks. They ate fish. They ate cows. In the middle here, you have a place where a brewery where they're making beer. And there's also bread here on the left you're going to see. And here's boats. So let's go into this and explore this a little bit. Okay. So we'd like to understand a little bit better the concepts of freedom in Egypt. We've spoken about the concept of the hierarchy of the pharaoh on top and how everybody had this mentality where the pharaoh controls the Nile. And if you're productive as a farmer, the pharaoh takes the credit for it, right? So we have all of that. But let's talk about the other thing about Egypt. Remember, Egypt has the Nile. Now, the Nile provides such surplus in agriculture, in grain, in wheat, emmer wheat it's called, that the Egyptian became a world economy, like a powerful economy, specifically because of their productivity of grain. And so they're called the gift of the Nile, or it's the bread basket of the Middle East. Egypt's production of grain enabled them to make so much grain, so much bread, that they became a superpower. And indeed, any empire that wanted to control the Middle East, all the way from Alexander the Great and all the way up to Napoleon, would conquer Egypt. Right? Because Egypt gives you, first of all, it's the bridge between Europe and Asia and Africa. It's right in the middle. Like you need to get to Israel. Like it's like you need to control it. And I was actually talking about a different thing. I was talking about why Israel is constantly contended. It's because it's the bridge. So never mind. But the reason Israel is so important is because it gives you access to Egypt, and Egypt feeds an empire. If you want to be able to control the world, you need to feed an army. How do you feed the army? You need the Nile, because the Nile gives you grain. So this is very important. Now, let's take this step by step. I want to kind of wrap up because we have like 9 more minutes. And then I'm going to open up for Q&A. I want to refer to specifically, we spoke about Egypt and the land of Israel. We contrasted them in terms of rainfall versus the Nile. Now let's talk about Egyptian food. So in Egypt, the first thing we do as Jews when we left the land of Egypt, of course, we start complaining, right? What are we complaining about? Well, we're complaining that we used to have good food, right? We used to be there in Egypt and we were fed because we were slaves. And when you're a slave, you get fed. So here's your food, right? We remember, and they basically said, if only we would have died in the desert. Oh, things were great in Egypt. If only we would have died in Egypt instead of being in this uncertainty in the desert. In Egypt, we had meat, flesh pots, and we had tons of bread. We just ate and ate bread. Everything. Life was good in Egypt, right? Now, I'm asking you a question. Like, well, let's first of all, one more. So we're zooming in. This is one of those little mini models where you have people, the granary and grinding and making bread and beer. So this is a bakery. So you have women on the left-hand side on the grindstone, And grinding wheat was something that you do every single day because you want to have fresh bread. So it's called the daily grind, right? That's where the expression the daily grind comes from. So these two women are in a grindstone, and there's a person in the middle who's making dough. You see his hands actually have powder, have flour on them. And this is a small painted wooden model. It's really cool. And on the right-hand side, there's somebody on the oven. Now, Egypt contributed to the world in very interesting ways. But one of the things that they did is they invented bread. Ladies and gentlemen, bread was invented in Egypt. And let me explain the significance of that. Egypt is settled along the Nile. You're not going anywhere, right? But if you are outside of Egypt, you're a nomad. You're traveling, like our forefathers, our avot and imahot, had sheep, had cattle. They traveled along the mountain ridge in the land of Israel, wherever it is that there is rain and whatever is good for grazing. You're constantly moving. If you're traveling, you don't have time to let your dough rise and sour and spoil. That's a stupid thing to do if you're a nomad. But in Egypt, you're not traveling anywhere. The Nile is there. The Pharaoh provides. It's all there. It's all good. So what do you have to do? Nothing. Let it sit and rise. And so Egypt had the circumstances that allowed them to have bread. And so Egypt invented bread. And this is going to be very important when we talk about chametz and matzah. We talk about what we do on Pesach. Very, very important. So one more detail. So one of the things that we complained about when we left Egypt is, of course, where are we going to get meat from, right? We're here in the desert, so God, of course, provides meat. But the point is our complaint. Look in verse 5 in Pasuk Hey. Oh, the free fish that we had, it was wonderful. And oh, the leeks and the watermelons and the squashes and the onions and the garlic, it was great. And what do we have now? Just that miserable man that we're dependent on every day. We don't like that. Fine. Chinam, look at that word free, chinam. Now, if chinam actually means free, which is questionable, how could you possibly say that? Just imagine, let me just take you to a dark reality. Imagine, God forbid, in Auschwitz, okay? People were starved to death. People were worked to death, and yet you were given free bread. Imagine, I mean, you have to stand in line to get a little bit of bread, sometimes soup. Imagine people saying, oh, things were good in Auschwitz, God forbid. We had free bread. I mean, what do you mean free? You were slaves. It's such a ridiculous, it's a mind-boggling thing to say. How could you possibly call the bread in Egypt for free, and the fish and the food and all that stuff? Unless the whole point is that as a slave, it's given to you. Because a slave is told what to do, when to do, how to do it, where to do it. You don't have to think about anything you do. And of course, you get free food. So the whole concept of chinam, and why chachamim, why the rabbis say that chinam means chinam min hamitzvot, means free of the commandments, is because in context, the word chinam literally means free of responsibility. I don't have to do anything. I'm a slave. My life is dictated to me. And so that word chinam actually is always seen in the Torah as a negative word, sinat chinam, right? Chinam is always seen as something which is like baseless, which is like not real. So here's a cool example of it. Now let's move one more. So here we are in Pesach, right? We're eating matzah. Now imagine we are in Egypt, okay? It's the 14th day of Nisan. We are told tonight you're going to be sitting in your houses, and I want you to stay away from bread and from beer, chametz, and so anything that rises. I want you to eat matzah. You got to do it quickly. You don't have time. Now, if any of you have been to matzah baking, unfortunately this year it's something I wish I could have done, but it's really, it's tricky this year. Matzah baking is all move, 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 move. There's no time to sit. There's no time to rest. You got to do this in 18 minutes and you got to move, right? Matzah is movement. It's kind of going back to those nomadic days when we were travelers, as opposed to Egypt food, which is bread and beer, like beer also chametz and se'o, which is the staple foods of Egypt. That's how they would pay the people who built the pyramids. They paid them with bread and beer. Right, you can get a lot of people to do stuff like men today will still do a lot for beers, so that hasn't changed so much. But bread and beer is how you pay. It's your basic food, right? And so Egypt's food, which has to do with the Nile and your dependency on the Nile and your connection to Paro, it's all involved in that bread. And so what Hashem is telling us in Egypt is on the day when you are going to be free, you have to stay away from Egypt mentality, from Egypt food, from slave food. You got to move, you got to work, you got to understand what it means to be free. And so here, I would like to, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I just want to wrap up and then open up for Q&A, is that, okay, second. Okay, one last idea is that H.E. Jacobs wrote a book called 6,000 years of bread. It's holy and unholy history. And in 6,000 years of bread, this is a baker, but he's a German guy, he was a reporter, and I think he was a baker in World War II in the American Army. And he wrote this fantastic book about the history of bread. The first 2 chapters of his book are about, first chapter is Egypt's invention of bread. And the second chapter of the book is the Jewish calendar starting at Nisan, which has to do with freedom and slavery related to bread, chametz, and matzah. It's a fascinating book. And in that, he points out something very, really incredible, is that when you have the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaBrit, you have to have these travel rods in it so that you can carry it and transport it in the desert, right? Now, when you're finally resting and you have either the tabernacle or the Mishkan in the land of Israel or the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, you can remove the carrying rods because you don't have to transport anything, except for one vessel, the Aron HaBrit, the Ark of the Covenant. And why is that? Because, and this is, H.E. Jacobs makes this connection. It is because Torah is movement, is life. Movement is life. And stasis, sitting there and letting things rise, is slavery, is slave mentality. It's the opposite of freedom. And so this concept of movement and matzah is the opposite of chametz. And this is kind of what a Torah is, movement and traveling and developing. It's a fascinating idea. And so on that note, I'm going to sum up that we kind of saw the power of Egypt in terms of its kingship, the economy, the land, the Nile, and all of those things that produce a mentality which dictates to you how to think about the world. And our concept of freedom and trying to experience Egypt today in 2020 and Tafshin Pei is to see how is there a society which can be dictating to me what to think about, how to think, what do I want? Is it what I want or is it what society wants me to have, right? And to think how we can be free people, even though there's a society that sort of can control our minds. To be free from that, that's Yetziat Mitzrayim in this generation. So thank you very much. Chag Sameach.